And if you had a digital clone of a CEO, I think that line gives you some benefits, but not a ton. And the reality, if you ask yourself, if you're Mark Zuckerberg, why would you want to do this? The answer is like every company, including Meta and a ton of other ones, one of which we'll talk about in a bit, have been trimming down middle management. Welcome to the Wellable Weekly podcast, where we talk about key topics and trends at the intersection of well-being, technology, and HR. I'm Nick, along with my good friend Geoff. Geoff, happy Marathon Monday.
Yeah, happy Marathon Monday. Always a highlight of the year in the Boston area, right? Yeah, for those who don't know, Wellable is headquartered in Boston, right in downtown Crossing. So we definitely get to experience the energy and all the things that come with Marathon Monday. But looks like you're in the office, so what's the vibe around the city?
I am in the office. I needed the mic to do the podcast, so had to come in. I mean, the city's dead if you're not in the marathon. If you're not either watching the marathon or running the marathon, no one's coming in. So I'm like the sole person on the tee that wasn't dressed up in like running gear. But it's different. It's good. It's a disruption from the mundane, typical commute. Like it's full of people who are, dressed up or trying to spectate the marathon. Our office is near the pickup. So for those who don't know, you get picked up in a ton of buses, like literally the entire road's closed, 3 lanes of all these buses that pick people up in Boston, drive them to Hopkinton, Mass, which is the start of the race, and then they run to Boston and then grab all their stuff that they left over. It's a crazy operation how they do it. And so I get off the tee and it's just like a little bit of chaos as everything is getting kicked off. But it was good. It's exciting. You feel like the momentum in the air. The weather is a little bit chilly, but it's actually perfect for the marathon. So hoping all the runners, exactly, perform super well. Speaking of mundane, the Wellable Weekly newsletter had a couple of articles that were all but mundane. My favorite one was about Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Meta, and an effort he's doing to effectively create a digital clone of himself. And so he's trying to create an AI version of Mark Zuckerberg so that the staff and all the employees of Facebook can interact directly with Mark. As you imagine, when you have like 80,000 employees, not everyone can work directly with Mark, but if he had a digital version of himself, that becomes a real possibility. So this AI tool is apparently trained on obviously everything that's publicly available for Mark, like his mannerisms, his tones, his thoughts, any public statements around company strategy, et cetera. But it's also trained on internal information that Mark has presented to the team that's not publicly available. And so the idea is that this clone has deep knowledge of who Mark is, what is he thinking, how would he deliver messages, and it becomes a very bespoke tool that an employee can use to maybe solicit Mark for ideas or feedback on their performance and things like that.
It was a interesting concept to think about, right? And one that elicited, I think, a few knee-jerk reactions from the broader business community. Some maybe not so fair to Mark, right? I know he's often been criticized for his public persona, which at times can kind of come off as a little bit more robotic. So something like this probably doesn't help that cause, but also kind of harkens back to the metaverse idea, right? Which several years ago, Meta put a ton of investment into and really set that as the future direction of their company, and didn't quite take off the way they had hoped. But something like this digital clone or other kind of forms of interactive avatars seems like maybe there's a version of that vision that might hit our B2B world. The other thing that came to mind for me is what those interactions would actually be like with this digital clone, right? And whether they would be of substance. And I was kind of picturing myself talking to a digital version of you, right, our CEO of Wellable. But I mean, often imitated, never replicated, whatever the phrase is. But I, found myself certainly appreciating the benefit or the potential benefit of being able to get your perspective on something when we didn't have a meeting together, or I can hit you with a Teams message for some reason. But I also thought of how oftentimes the feedback you give is nuanced. There's a lot of context that's taken into consideration, and sure, you can program some of that into the digital clone, which I'm sure they will, right? But I kept coming back to where would the line be where this digital clone would provide a a statement or feedback of substance, take a stance on something that an employee could act on versus having a guardrail in place to know that I probably don't want to go there because I'm giving this individual an opinion that may not fully reflect Mark Zuckerberg's point of view on that.
Exactly. That line is extremely hard to define. I was trying to put myself in the shoes and say, oh, if I could have an AI version of myself, what would I do? And I think like the quick win would be, I underappreciated this, but I think this is true for all CEOs. You spend an inordinate amount of time repeating yourself, right? You may be at an all hands meeting with the entire company. You make a comment about, hey, this is our new AI initiative. And then you're in a bunch of smaller meetings where people are kind of peeling back the onion, asking the same questions around, hey, what do you mean by this? And how are we going to execute on that initiative? And just a lot of repeat, right? And that's just, it's par for the course. Like, I'm not complaining about it, but if there was a way to say, you can talk with all those questions you may have, and all these people have different questions, to a digital clone that can re-articulate the original statement and maybe go in a little bit deeper way to answer some of those things, I think would be pretty powerful. Where I think that line certainly becomes harder to draw, and I think I would probably say this wouldn't make sense, is often when we're talking or you're asking for my feedback on something, Geoff, as example, I'm like giving you it, but I'm also like trying to see your response to it, right? Whether it's feedback of you as an individual, or hey, you're sharing an idea, and I'm like, well, I'm like giving you my thoughts as well as like trying to test them with you, right? Like, does this work? Does it not? And like a lot of times you start at point A, but by the end of the meeting, you've changed and shifted in a good way. Like, it creates openness for flexibility. And like when my interaction with the AI tool, there's like no flexibility. When you give them a question, whether it's right or wrong, they speak with absolute confidence. And we also know about AI tools that, from the Stanford research study that we talked about previously, that they're very sycophantic. And so they're designed to like give you feedback or give you critiques and responses that are meant to make you happy, right? And so in theory, that's not really the goal of like a CEO. His goal is to provide candor and transparency to you, not necessarily give you information that may be sugar coated in a certain way to make it land better. And it's hard to see how you untrain an AI model to do that. I'm sure you can. And like we always say, right now, today, this is the worst AI will ever be, but we are living in today. And if you had a digital clone of a CEO, I think that line gives you some benefits, but not a ton. And the reality, if you ask yourself, if you're Mark Zuckerberg, why would you want to do this? The answer is like every company, including Meta and a ton of other ones, one of which we'll talk about in a bit, have been trimming down middle management, right? I think Meta now is at 50-1, so 50 employees to every manager. They're about to embark on a couple other layoffs, which I think is going to drive that number higher. And so even forget the CEO, that one manager, maybe they will benefit from an AI clone of themselves just to be able to manage 50, 100 people. And the other story in the Wellable Weekly is this story about Block, the CEO, Jack Dorsey, effectively, they're laying off 40% of their workforce, going down from 10,000 to 6,000 employees. And he wrote this blog post along with the Sequoia, the VC firm, right, a partner there. And effectively, he was saying that he plans to reduce his management layers from 5 managers right now, right, in 2 to 3 years, to eventually get down to like 0, right? So 0 being, yes, there's 6,000 employees, assuming they stay the same, and everyone directly reports into him. And if you just try to forget the craziness of the idea, if you say, how are you going to execute on it? It has to come through a digital clone of yourself. There's no other way to make that work.
I think the concept of what middle managers do, right, can be as extreme as just information passers, right, to those who really add value and help manage projects and things like that. I think that same article, right, Andy Jassy refers to cutting well-intentioned middle managers, and ultimately whether it's this version of an AI clone from Mark Zuckerberg to new adoption of just AI tools across an organization to make things overall more efficient, it does feel like there's a natural accretive benefit to accelerating that dispersion of information. And you think about the scenario that you described with an all hands meeting, or repeating different strategic directives in any number of communications, be it separate meetings, be it emails, right? To have any sort of AI clone, or an avatar that folks could go to ask questions and get approved kind of feedback or messaging. We don't even have to go into that world of iteration and nuance that we talked about, right? That's going to be very difficult to replicate in that type of dynamic. But even if you could just take that 80% of communication that is playing the game of telephone across all those different channels. And we, of course, experience it to some extent in an organization like Wellable, but it's just magnified at these, tech behemoths. So the notion of just, cutting down on that game of telephone and having streamlined communication, to the point where maybe you don't need folks to serve those, roles of, upward and kind of downward shuffling information. It's not to say that there's no role for management, whatsoever. It's just hopefully allowing, those folks to, I think, as Jack Dorsey put in the article, live on the edge, in the sense of just purely be focused on their respective domains and getting support from colleagues where needed, but certainly to a much higher degree now in the future from a whole bunch of different tools that they'll have at their disposal.
Exactly. I mean, so it's a bold prediction. So I actually like Jack Dorsey for throwing something out there, but effectively he's predicting the extinction of middle management. So whether that happens, TBT, it's hard to see how that happens, right? To be honest with you, but you can see how the number of employees per manager drastically increases because of AI. One thing that I think is certainly a hurdle is, to my knowledge, I don't think anyone ever gets hired for a job without interviewing with their manager. That may be true, right? But never in any organization that I've ever worked with. And so if just to even be able to manage 100 people, you have to, at some point, if you've been at a company for a while, you had to interview and hire 100 people. And that's really, really challenging. And so, the benefit now, you're seeing this in the workforce today. HR teams are using AI to sift through resumes, identify good candidates. I think in some cases, if they're really progressive, is proactively reach out to good candidates, like via LinkedIn, that you've identified that fit the, skill set and the criteria that you want to have. That being said, the other side of the river is also using AI. You have employees like sprucing up their resume specifically to get through AI filters, creating really bespoke, customized cover letters for every single employer. And the employer who does read it goes, oh, wow, this person put a lot of care and thought because it's so specific to my company. But they're doing that to like hundreds of companies. And it allows these individuals to apply to multiples more companies than they could originally, and do so in a really quality way. So you're having this real challenge. In the Wellable Weekly article, share an idea that some companies are doing now, which is like the week-long trial. So put aside like how you actually execute it logistically, which seems hard to do, given that someone may have another job, and how do they do a trial with you? But I love the concept where you're there, for you as the employee. This is good for you because you can see this organization firsthand, get more interactions in a very specific, like more real world environment than an interview, for how your manager works and operates, et cetera, what the company values are, what have you. It makes you a way better informed consumer of whether you want to work there or not. Likewise, the employer gets the benefit of saying, how do you respond to feedback? How quickly can you work? How high quality is that work? There's a challenge to what you can meaningfully do in a week, but no question, it's better than just a set of interviews. And I find that really interesting and compelling, where if you're trying to aspire to the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Jack Dorseys of the world, you would have to think that this could be an interesting way to implement it, is have these individuals come in, interact with your digital clone or some version of that, have another AI tool assess those interactions and the quality of work and all the things that are critical to you on your end in terms of making decision to hire, and then give out the offers accordingly. And so I don't know, it seems like we're in a little bit of a bubble in terms of like that working perfectly, but you can see the path there, and I find it really interesting.
Right. I mean, it seems like one of those ideas where if you had enough time, enough resources on both sides, right, employer and prospective candidate, it would be a win-win. And in any scenario like that, where it's just a lack of time or a lack of infrastructure, there will be paths towards getting some version of that. Not to say that for every role you're going to have a week-long trial, but thinking about it from both sides as a manager who's trying to hire very deliberately and make sure it's a great fit for the company and for the individual, and also someone again who has been in the job market in the past. It's just one of those things that will be an incredible advancement in what has become, as you noted, just a kind of a flurry of job postings and highly customize with the use of AI resumes and cover letters and that sort of thing. So that seems like a great place to wrap up the podcast today. So thanks as always for those who tune in. You can always catch us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Be sure to subscribe to Wellable Weekly for the latest insights. Thank you.